moment, it's absent in that agenda, and that's me done.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Thanks, and Lucy. It's a great talk about, as you say, not a global city. So I think it's a good balance to some of the discussions this afternoon as well. So thank you very much. Got time for quick questions, comments, as always, from the floor. Michael? Michael, you have your hand up? No, okay, sorry.
Of course.
Any comments, questions? Jess? Yeah, Jess.
John, I was just thinking about this, the role of social infrastructure, linking that to the foundational economy or the everyday economy, and what you think is the potential for, the growth of a local economy based around that.
I'm not sure there's much potential for the growth of the local economy based around that. And part of my, part of the thinking around the foundational economy idea is that maybe growth is not what it's about in these places. Maybe what policy should be about is the provision of better quality, basic, universal services which allow life to continue in those villages, even if there aren't the kind of economic opportunities that you'll find in superstar cities. And the strong theme that comes from, I think, the discussions we're having in the village, the ongoing discussions we're having in the village, is this sense that what people want is conviviality. They want opportunities to meet, discuss, cooperate around a common future. And that's the most difficult thing to achieve. And part of the reason for that is that the spaces within which that traditionally happened in the village have all vanished. So it's that kind of issue that we're trying to think through. There isn't ever going to be a replacement for the pit. There are jobs being created, but they're outside of the village. And the village faces the possible danger of just being a kind of dead community which supplies people to lower paid, precarious jobs elsewhere. And by concentrating on this foundational economy and the social infrastructure within it, meeting needs which are not being met at the moment, there's a potential strategy there which could deal with human needs in the village, but also with this sense of loss that people feel about, and this sense of being left behind by broader changes in the economy and society.
Michael?
Durham County Council tried to cope with the problem of infrastructure by axing a whole load of villages from the map. And I see that Sacriston narrowly avoided becoming a Category D village in 1956, according to Wikipedia. You didn't mention that, John, but to what extent does your foundational message, can you learn from the history of what happened once it had been reprieved from the official
you're right. There was this Category D back in the 50s when it was clear that the future of some of these villages was doubtful. There was the county council really planned for their demise and allocated certain villages to this Category D in the County Durham plan. Most of those very, very few of those villages have disappeared. They're all hanging on. Largely, they may lack infrastructure and investments, they may not have a primary school and so on, but they're still there. And the reason is that housing is very cheap in those places. And particularly with car-borne lifestyles, you can live in those places, very cheap housing, and do your shopping elsewhere, drop the kids at school, work elsewhere if you have a job. These are rapidly aging populations as well. That's another dimension of the story, which we haven't had time to talk about today. So Sacriston survived because of the nature of the coal that it was producing, which was important for the coking coal for the steel industry. Otherwise, it probably would have been a Category D village, and that would have meant its infrastructure would have run down. So these are not problems, I would argue, which have emerged in many of these places since the Brexit referendum or since the 2008 financial crisis. This is when we're seeing this kind of left behindness and the populist backlash, we're seeing the results of decades of neglect of these communities, really. And I think that that's something which we can draw attention to in our analysis of what's happening in County Durham. So it's not something, this is not something that's suddenly appeared, it's been something that's been growing for a very long time.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Lucy. I think to move on to the last presentation of the afternoon now, which is by Claire and Tatiana. Claire, are you there? There you are. Yeah. Okay, hand over to you. That's good, yeah. You're on mute, Claire.
Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can now.
Hello.
We can now.
Hi. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. I just wanted to say that I hope it will make sense. I had my first shot of the vaccine yesterday and I feel really under the weather this afternoon. So hopefully this will be clear enough. Tatiana cannot join us, but what I'm going to present is the result of collaborative work that took different stages involving people that I will introduce a bit later in the presentation. So the project really started taking stock of new forms of digital or so-called platform capitalism that have emerged over the past 10 years with the creation of new online mediating services that put together users and a number of goods or services that are supposedly part of the sharing economy, although it's no longer about sharing, as I will show you. And the central focus of our project has been the rise in short-term holiday rentals mediated by platforms such as Airbnb, which has become a hugely contentious issue in many cities. And I don't have the time to summarize the argument for and against short-term rentals. They're positive on urban economies and neighborhoods. I have summarized them in this slide. I simply want to talk a little bit about probably the number one critique or source of contention about the impact of short-term rental in many European cities, which is their impact on neighborhood and the housing market. There have been a proliferation of studies from economic geographers, from spatial economists that have shown that in high demand cities where you have both a tense housing market, strong demographic pressures, and a high number of visitors, the proliferation of short-term rented apartment has contributed to a net decline in the housing stock that's available for long-term occupation. And this is very marked in particular neighborhood, and possibly, although this is hard to measure, to increases in rental prices in neighborhood popular with visitors. There are very complex methodological challenges and discussion about those impacts, but there tends to be a relative agreement that they are quite significant in certain central neighborhoods in a number of cities. So a couple of years ago, we identified some research gap in relation to this phenomenon. We became interested with the fact that the issue became a source of social mobilization and conflict, and that some city governments were trying to develop new forms of regulation to control this phenomenon, some very restrictive, some less so. And when we started looking at the literature, we realized that a lot of it was about economic impacts or the visitor's experience coming from tourism and management studies, but there was very little work on the politics of this, or if you want, the social mobilization, the conflict between actors, the political economy of who is fighting for and against regulation. And we also found there was very little comparative work about the type of regulatory instruments, planning or otherwise, that are being developed in different cities. So we decided to test a pilot project. So the project really had two stages. In 2016, I did a very small desk-based study commissioned by Barcelona City Council on what was happening in other cities when they were trying to start their own regulation. And then with two colleagues, Thomas Aguilera and Francesca Artioli, who are political scientists, we did a pilot study comparing what was going on in Barcelona, Paris, and Milan to try and develop some comparative hypotheses. So it was really, we didn't have hypotheses, we developed them by comparing processes of politicization in these three cities. And the third step of that study took place with Tatiana Morera and was funded by a little grant from the previously named RIX Research Trust, now Property Research Trust. We finished a report with a lot of delay a couple of weeks ago. And that report looks at the politics, if you want, of regulation in 12 cities that are listed on this slide. We deliberately focused on large cities with tense housing markets. We left out smaller places or smaller cities. And you can see on this slide some of the methods we've used, process tracing, a lot of of document analysis, legal court cases analysis. We interviewed a total of nearly 70 actors in 9 cities, and we also did participant observation. For example, I was invited to follow inspectors for a day in Barcelona on the road to see how they inspect and control illegal short-term rentals. So these are the questions we try to answer in our study. I've hinted at some of them. How has the issue become politicized? How do public actors seek to regulate? What challenges arise for those public actors in terms of enforcement and implementation? And what new relationship of cooperation of conflict develop between public authorities and this new type of transnational companies that are the digital platforms? Before I summarize our findings, just to clarify that when we talk about short-term rentals, we analytically identified 3 main types of practices, and they're very different from one another, and they are more or less controversial. The first one is the full-time holiday apartment, the one that is rented the whole year round as a holiday let, and usually run by professional or investors. The other 2 types are what you would think of as home sharing in a strict sense. That is, you renting your flat for a couple of weeks when you go on holiday on Airbnb, or renting a room within your main home to visitors whilst you live in the place. So in the study of, if you want, the politics and the conflict around it, we broadly identified 6 categories of actors and interest groups that fight in the politics of regulation, for regulation or against regulation. I won't have time to introduce them all, but we were very interested in the narratives that each of these actors put forward to support or oppose regulation. We have the professional organization representing holiday-let operators. We have the hotel industry, obviously having a vested interest in seeing what they see as competition being regulated. We have a lot of housing activists and residents association fighting against holiday rentals. We have very powerful platforms, I'll talk about it. And we have some emerging figures like new grassroots association of home sharers defending their right to share. And in one of the early papers we did, we tried to conceptualize and typologize a bit these actors on a diagram that was trying to identify what narrative and what rights they were defending when discussing regulation. We can come back to this in the discussion. For example, contrasting the right to freely use one's property, which came back in all the interviews we had with Association of Property Owners, versus the right to stay put and the right to housing that was mobilized by housing activists and resident association. So across the 12 cities, we have a huge diversity of local regulations that have emerged. Some are enacted through tourism, others through land use planning, others through housing bylaws, others through taxation, others through business and trade licensing. So we have a huge diversity of, if you want, entry points to try and regulate the phenomenon. And we also have a huge diversity of approaches altogether, with cities where there's a general laissez-faire approach with no or little regulation, like Prague, Rome, and Milan, to cities where there is a de facto quasi-prohibition or very strong limitation on the growth of short-term rental. Berlin, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Madrid being the contemporary cases. And in all our cities, many of our cities, we witness very strong multi-level governance conflicts. London is obviously a good example where there's a clear tension between a pro-regulatory agenda from local authorities and even Sadiq Khan and the GLA versus a very deregulatory agenda from central government through the 2015 Deregulation Act. What exactly is being regulated? I won't bore you with the detail of all the instruments we uncovered. Some have to do with simply authorizing or giving visibility, if you want, to a particular use of a housing unit. Some are about setting quality standards through very strict safety requirements. A few cities have experimented with trying to limit the overall quantity of short-term rental. This is very difficult to implement in practice through zoning and land use planning mechanism. Many cities have tried to distinguish between the different categories of short-term rental that I've mentioned before to try and tame the speculative uses and tolerate or allow the occasional renting out of your property when you're away, making a strong distinction between a professional versus a non-professional use of such property. And many cities have also used taxation, either the city tax or income tax as a way to regulate. So Out of our 12 cities, 6 try to use planning or licensing mechanism to actually quantitatively restrict the growth of short-term rental. And I have mentioned them here. They all use different mechanism. I can talk about it in the discussion. And although this sounds interesting and great on paper, in all those cases, there are significant problems and difficulties in actually implementing whatever mechanism has been devised to control short-term rentals. And there are 3 main challenges in the implementation that we've identified, and they really came up in all the cities. First, there's classical challenges that have to do with planning enforcement or housing enforcement. Cities and local authorities have limited resources and capacity for physical inspection, especially when operators of short-term rental, those who speculate around that, have very elaborate strategies to avoid being caught if they're illegal. And during the day when I followed the inspector in Barcelona, he listed for me, and we witnessed firsthand all the lies and the disguise strategy that people illegally running a short-term rental utilize to avoid detection. And that's not particularly new. That could happen with any form of planning control. What is really new in the case of this object is the key role of platforms as withholding access to precise data from public authorities. So effectively, you have public authorities that are trying to regulate a phenomenon for whom they do not have precise data, because the only organization that actually know exactly who is offering a short-term rental, where, in what capacity, and for how long are the digital platform, and they have refused to hand over that data, invoking in the European context the e-commerce directive. And this has led to what colleagues Lily Hoffman in the US has called data wars between city council. In the US, these data wars were initiated by San Francisco and New York City. And in Europe, a number of cities where we have carried out interviews expanded a lot on the battles that they have been waging with platforms to try and access data. And finally, the third problem with implementation is that these regulations remain heavily contested and challenged by multiple actors who mobilize socially, politically, and legally around those regulations. So there are very strong mobilization from those who are perceived to lose from more regulation of the sector, the platforms, association of landlords, but also association of so-called home sharers in cities who are involved in heavy communication campaign, lobbying, and court cases to topple the regulation, sometimes successfully, with some regulation that have had to be withdrawn because of successful court cases. And here, one of our probably most interesting finding is the power and the role of digital platforms as a new urban political actor. And we're trying to develop this idea a little bit. The most emblematic of them, Airbnb, is investing millions in activities of lobbying, in staffing very organized public policy units, often recruiting people with public administration experience. Airbnb has published their own policy and regulation guidelines. It's called the Policy Tool Chest, and it's a document that they bring to cities telling them this is how we want to be regulated. And most importantly, Airbnb has also invested heavily in strategies of political influence based on mobilizing its own users. So you can see here, I recommend a wonderful report published by a sociologist from Manchester, Luke Yates, who's done a brilliant study published about a month ago, where he has investigated how Airbnb mobilizes its own users to pressure for regulation. For example, sending an email to Airbnb users in Barcelona, asking them to protest against the new regulation of the city council, and they draft the text of the protest email you have to send to the city council.
5 minutes.
Yeah. And finally, the last point I wanted to mention, this controversial politics of regulation, which is something we didn't expect and that really became very strong in as we did the research, is in its most recent development, there is a very strong judicialization and transnationalization of what was initially a local battle, a battle between a city council, property owners, and a platform. And in the European context, the European Union has become the key battleground for the future of the city's right to regulate. The opponents of regulation, Airbnb or other platforms, which are represented by a lobby called the European Holidays Home Association, invoke 2 pieces of EU legislation, the e-commerce directive and the services directive, to try and topple the regulations that are developed by cities. And here, the ultimate arbiter will be the Court of Justice of the European Union. And I will not bore you with the detail, but it has effectively published rulings which are a little bit in contradiction with one another. One of the rulings was very favorable to Airbnb and seemed to support its capacity to act without having to hand over data to public authorities. On the other hand, it has published recently another ruling that supported the city of Paris in its decision to enact strong regulation of short-term rentals on its territory. So for the moment, things are going in a number of directions. What is happening at this point in time is that two very significant pieces of EU law are being discussed in the European Parliament, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. They're very technical, but they will have a massive influence on the social media and the large tech companies that we use on a daily basis. Google, Amazon, Facebook, all of these are massively concerned and affected by this proposal. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of lobbying going on in Brussels right now on behalf of these big tech companies, including some of the large-scale platforms we've been looking at. And what has been interesting to witness is that the individual city leaders and politicians and planners who are alone fighting their own battle locally have started talking to each other in 2016 through a first meeting that took place in Barcelona. And I've realized that they were all fighting in isolation, the very same transnational companies. And they were, if you want, they basically should organize themselves to make their voice heard at the EU level in ways that were as effective as these big companies with a lot of capital to invest in lobbying practices. So over the past 2 years, we've had a very interesting development of city leaders getting together, exchanging knowledge, and making public policy demand and regulatory demand together at the level of European institutions. I have mentioned some of these on these slides, and they are intensifying their activities as we speak because the European Parliament is in the process of considering the legislation I have mentioned, which will have huge implication for individual cities' capacity to regulate.
2 minutes, Claire.
So conclusion, there are key political challenges involved in the phenomenon we've been looking at. Unsurprisingly, as with many other uses of the built environment, the regulatory choices involve arbitrages between the freedom to use a private property and conduct an economic activity based on exchange value versus the necessary protection of public interest objective, in particular the protection of the long-term residential stock in cities with strong housing inequalities. And here you could say that the project, addresses questions that Callum has been mentioning before and that are not particularly novel. How to regulate housing, ownership use in an era where it has become a commodity in the context of global investment. But the added layer, if you want, to that debate is the question of the digital economy and transnational companies, how to regulate this digital economy. And in particular, what is the role of these big tech platforms in urban governance? Just to finish, the last thing I wanted to say is now after publishing the report, which is very policymaker oriented, we're trying to reread the results and link them back to key debates in urban studies to theorize a little bit from the empirical findings. And we're going to try and engage with 4 strands of debates that I've hinted at. One is the rise of platform capitalism and what it means for the governance of cities. One is all the debate about the impact of the mobility of the global middle classes and what it does to cities, second homeowners, tourists. And the third debate is obviously financialization and the shift to asset-based capitalism, given that short-term rentals are a new asset class for investors. And we're trying to do this building on the comparative framework of what is governed. So yeah, that's a brief presentation of the report that was co-authored with Tatiana. And on these slides, I've highlighted the next steps in terms of activities and publications that we hope to derive from that project. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for that set of insights there. Thank you. Okay, so for the last 5 minutes or so, open the floor to comments or questions. Any comments or questions?
Graveyard slot. Everybody is exhausted. It's okay.
I can always ask a question, Claire. So some of the I mean, I thought it was a very powerful analysis and of a new type of class to think, to regulate, or a new type of group. It comes back to some of what Callum was saying right at the beginning of the session about conflicts around ownership and assets and so on. I mean, we've been rereading in the WIG project some of James Scott's classic work on seeing like a state, and I wonder how that's relevant to this, because of course Scott was arguing from an anthropological perspective of a very powerful set of modernist thinking in planning and a very top-down view of cities and city governance and planning. But here you seem to have a category of quite powerful individuals who are almost beyond view, or they're viewed in a different way. And I wonder if there's anything in some of that work around seeing like a state that one could also reflect on from your findings, and have a think back to some of what Scott and others are arguing about the power of vision, but also the power of invisibility and the role of informality. But it is not informal, it's something different to those things. So I just wonder if you can comment on some of those, whether there are insights there.
So, because I'm working with two political scientists, Tom and Francesca, that you know, we are definitely reading James Scott, and they're obsessed about this. So we are trying to develop, we'll have a whole section in the book, we're going to write about this on enumerating. And you can't govern something if you can't enumerate it and put statistics on it. And that's the whole debate here. Platforms are withholding the data. What's interesting is how city government have told us they've come up with alternative mechanism to produce their own sources of data in the absence of this privately governed private data. And we've heard very interesting stories of them collaborating with data activists, with grassroots organizations that were hacking the data for them. Some city councils off the record told us they've hired little IT genius to crack the data from Airbnb. And we've heard quite a few stories off the record that we couldn't put in the report about alternative methods of data production, which was really interesting. I think the other aspect we are trying to develop with Tatiana specifically, we've recently presented this at a conference in Cambridge on housing informality. And so we are also going to try to engage with discussion led by Francesco Chiodelli and others on the governance of housing informality in the global north, because this is a form of housing informality, one of the middle class, not one of slums and back garden houses or slums, but this is also a form of informality that escapes traditional planning processes. So we are just experimenting at this stage, but we would like ideally to engage with these debates.
Thank you. Michael, and then Jess.
Michael. Me?
Yeah.
2 quick points. Very interesting indeed, Claire. 2 quick points. The first is that the British Office of National Statistics is currently doing a review about housing statistics, thinking what should they cover, what are the policy issues which need transformation or evolution or change in the way statistics are defined and gathered. And I'm sure they would love to see this and would find it really useful. And we're in touch with the people if you need to know who it is. The second thing is, this is a parochial question, but I saw in your list of cities which are getting together to confront collectively the platform operators, that London was included in the list. Does this mean that in some way the GLA is continuing to behave as though we were members of the European Union?
That actually, this is fair enough. That declaration that I think that I mentioned was done before the effective Brexit. So it is interesting. I don't know what will happen now. We interviewed Tom Copley 3 years ago when we did this project, who back then was not yet Deputy Mayor for Housing, but he as GLA Labour member, published a report on Airbnb and short-term rental, and he was really championing that issue in the GLA. We have written to him again last week to send him on the report and to ask him for an update, and we haven't yet heard from him post-election. I suppose he was busy. So one of the things we'd like to find out is precisely that, whether they're going to continue to work with other cities, which would make less sense in terms of immediate EU law, or whether my guess would be that they will refocus their attention on national government and work probably with Karen Buck, who is MP for Westminster North, who's been putting forward legislation in the Parliament about this. And Scotland is also going to present in the Scottish Parliament regulation to create a licensing scheme. So there may be some movement, but obviously now much more separate from this question of EU regulation.
And finally, Jess.
Thank you, Claire. It was so interesting. So nice to see all that work come to fruition. that to me, this point about the data and obscuring data was really powerful in your presentation. And I wondered, is Uber, I think I saw Uber as a partner on the report at one point. I don't know.
No, we didn't get sponsored, thankfully, from any platform. I just put their logos on the first slide to illustrate the type of platforms that are captured by this concept of platform capitalism.
Right, it made me think, gosh, there must be all sorts of data that around transport and pollution and this kind of stuff that that Uber is obscuring.
I mean, some companies, we have a colleague in Paris who is a data sociologist who's doing a lot of work on which big companies agree to collaborate with public authorities to hand over data for public use. And Google, for example, has actually partnered with a lot of local authorities through Google Maps to monitor traffic. So there is all sorts of degrees of relationship. But I suppose we always need to ask ourselves, why is a private company doing it? What is in it for them? And certainly in the case of digital platform, the only two cities in Europe that have managed to get Airbnb to hand over the data are Paris and Barcelona after a huge political battle. And in the case of Paris, following a national law that was passed by the French parliament that forces the company to submit once a year the listing of the people who've advertised the flat. And the list they submit, we were told a few weeks ago by officials in Paris, is incomplete. Half of the addresses are missing and it needs to be tidied up. And yeah, so it's a big battle. And that's the number one demand from the cities on the national and European stage. Their argument is we can develop all the theoretical regulations we want, do all the zoning plans in the world. If we don't know where the object is, and if we have no way to, follow up what's happening to a housing unit, we will never be able to regulate.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Thanks to everybody for speaking in that session. That was a really enjoyable session to listen to. Thank you. It was great. So thanks for all your efforts and all your work. And thanks everybody coming along today. I think it's been a successful day. I think things have worked well. And thanks to Julie and Vicky for setting things up and being supportive. We will, as I've been saying a couple of times in the comments, Julie and I will collect links to everybody's chapters or publications that they've mentioned if they're out there, and we'll circulate those at some point in the next week or so. And also this recording, an edited version of this recording will be put together by Julie. We'll think about what to do with that. I think we'll circulate it. If anybody doesn't want what they've said retrospectively in there, then fine, just let us know, of course, and we'll take things out. Okay, so it's not definitely going to be in there. Okay, thank you all. Back to the day job now. So thanks, that was a good distraction from the day job. But good to see you all, and I'll see you all again soon somewhere. Okay. All right, thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Julie, do you want to stay on for a moment?
Yeah.
It really feels like a university department. Very good.
Yes. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your contributions, Michael, today. So, Julie, just quickly,